on a manuscript, a book, your entire life. And this is the single manuscript copy of your book. And now imagine that that same very book has been taken away from you by your captives. What would you do? Your life's work taken away in an instant. Well, this was the world of Dr. Viktor Frankl. And this is the book that he authored much later called Man's Search for Meaning. How would you cope with this? According to a survey of lifetime readers conducted by the Library of Congress, the largest library in the world, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl is one of the top 10 most influential books of all time, having sold over 16 million copies worldwide and having been translated into dozens of different languages. Man's Search for Meaning follows the journey of the psychiatrist Dr. Viktor Frankl as he entered the world of imprisonment and began to take a seat in his patient's chair and analyze his own mind, much the same way that he would analyze the mind of his patients. The book is divided into 3 sections. The first being a memoir of Dr. Frankl's journey and time in concentration camp. The second, a summary of logotherapy, that is the study of meaning in one's life, Dr. Frankl's contribution to the area of psychotherapy, that is. And the third and final section of the book is dealing with tragic optimism. That deals with how people find meaning in tragic and difficult suffering circumstances. So let's jump right into this amazing book. Big idea and major idea number 1. The first major idea in the book that we can find is that he who has a why to live can deal with almost any how. Dr. Frankl talks about and shares a story of 2 prisoners who were there in the concentration camps with him. Both of them were contemplating ending their lives and taking their lives, but they ultimately decided not to. And the reasons as to why they decided not to are interesting to note. Dr. Frankl highlighted that one of the individuals decided not to take their life because they believed that their child was waiting for them on the outside in another country, and they were waiting to be reunited with their loved one. This was one. The other individual did not take their life because they were a scientist and they knew that they had much work that had not been published that they still needed to publish. This pursuit of publishing the unfinished work inspired this individual to carry on and not take their own life. It's here that Dr. Frankl understood that he who has a why for their life can deal with almost any how, however difficult that how may be. For the first individual, it was their love of their child, their love of their loved one who was waiting for them on the other side. And for the scientist, it was the work, the love of knowledge and sharing that knowledge with others, which motivated and inspired the individual to keep going. In Dr. Frankl's own case, he reflects that it was his love for his wife, who he yearned to meet afterwards, that kept him going in the most difficult and the most dire circumstances. Beyond that, Dr. Frankl also envisioned giving lectures after he was released to his respective audiences. This also motivated him and inspired. He who has a why to live can deal with almost any how. Major idea number 2 from the book. When we cannot change our circumstances, we are forced to change ourselves. There's an example of a patient in Dr. Frankl's work who could not deal with the death of his wife. A very difficult and traumatic circumstance. He couldn't come to terms with the agony, the pain, the sadness, the depression of losing his wife. Dr. Frankl paused and reflected on his patient's ideas and thoughts about dealing with the loss of his wife. And he paused and he thought, and he looked back at his patient and he asked one question. And he said, "What if the tables had been turned?" The patient said, "Excuse me, what do you mean?" "Well, what if you had died and she was left to remain? And she was living and you had died?" The patient froze and began to contemplate. And then he paused, and after the brief pause he said, "Well, she would suffer, she would feel pain, she would feel a sense of agony and anguish and depression, the same way I'm feeling it." Then Dr. Frankl said, "Can you imagine and can you consider that by her dying before you, you saved her from the pain and the agony of having to deal with your death? You saved her from feeling those same emotions that you yourself are feeling right now?" The patient paused, and at that moment, he stood up, shook Dr. Frankl's hand, and left the office, having understood what Dr. Frankl just said. Dr. Frankl here understood that when we are no longer able to change our circumstances, we are forced to change our mindset and we are forced to change ourselves. Dr. Frankl knew that he couldn't bring his wife back to life, but he knew that he could change the perception around the death in the mind of the individual. Think about that in your own life, how you can reframe environments. Who have you saved from suffering? Big idea and major idea number 3 from the book is that there are 3 elements of meaning in our lives. There's work meaning, there's experience meaning, and there's attitude meaning. And we'll go through each of these very quickly with respect to what they mean. Dr. Frankl argues that meaning in work is when our passions and what we love are aligned with our work. This actually relates to the work of another famous author by the name of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who wrote the very famous book entitled Flow. That when we are doing the work that we love and are passionate about, time flies by, and many times we don't even notice. Dr. Frankl is echoing the same idea, that when we do what we're passionate about and our work has meaning to us, we end up doing better and we actually end up going much further. On top of this, the next level of meaning is meaning and experience. Dr. Frankl argues that we should experience meaning in such things as love. Love for our family, love for our friends, love for our spouses, love for people in our lives that are important to us. And this, he argues, is the antidote for our modern world of materialism. Because when we feel emotions such as love for our family and loved ones and our spouses, we no longer have to worry about the emptiness that may emerge from materialism of houses and cars and other things that don't have that sense of meaning and purpose. Dr. Frankl was able to experience this in the form of his infection for his wife, which helped him get through imprisonment. Meaning and attitude, the third level, is understood by how we deal with suffering, how we deal with those difficult circumstances and find meaning in those difficult circumstances that we may be dealing with in our own lives, the greater meaning behind the suffering. This may be a very powerful way to have meaning in our attitudes. Dr. Frankl argued that suffering may actually be a huge human achievement. Why? In order to understand what life demands of us, unfortunately, the only way to come about to that realization of what I'm meant to do and what my purpose is through challenges and suffering. Therefore, suffering is seen as a way of helping us understand what life is and what life demands of us, and it helps us understand our greater purpose and our greater meaning. The major idea number 4 of this book is that prisoners who concentrated on their inner lives were more likely to survive than those who focused on their external lives. Those people who imagined their loved ones in their memories, in their imagination and the memories that they held, those individuals got through better. Those individuals had remembered the good times. They were the ones who thrived and flourished. What did they remember? They remembered dinners around the table with their family and their loved ones. They remembered walks in the parks. They remembered the beach visitations and spending time by the seashore. These memories empowered the prisoners. They understood that imagination, thoughts of the past, were things that the guards could not steal, could not snatch from them, and they belonged to them. This was the idea of the last freedom that the ancient philosophers talked about. Your thoughts cannot be stolen from you. The way that they would relive these moments with their loved ones really showed a powerful sense of the human mind. They imagined these conversations with their loved ones. Even in their imagination, this helped. Because again, the guards could not touch these thoughts. Even when a bird was flying overhead and they looked at this and they were grateful and they thought about the beauty of this moment, it helped them tremendously. Further than this, Dr. Frankl noticed that those who channeled their inner meaning and spiritual lives and who lived in accordance to these spiritual meanings and these values, they did better. For example, those prisoners who channeled their spiritual lives and their values, they would take bread that they needed themselves, but they would give this bread to their fellow prisoners. This was them channeling their spiritual and their value-based lives, and this helped them live more resiliently and longer. Logotherapy, which is Dr. Frankl's contribution to psychotherapy, argues that motivation to act comes from our sense of meaning. There's actually scientific data to back this up, a substantial amount, in fact. Those who have meaning are more resilient in life. Take, for example, a study conducted by Johns Hopkins University in the United States. It found in a survey asking what are the most important things in life, it found that an overwhelming majority of people said that the most important thing in life for them is to find a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose. In fact, 78% of the respondents said that to find a sense of meaning and sense of purpose was the most important thing for them in their lives, because it counters the sense of emptiness and lack of meaning that exists in our world. And this is what's called the existential dilemma, or the existential vacuum that Dr. Frankl identified. The point number 5, major idea number 5, and the final idea that we'll be discussing here from the book, is that those who have their own personal sense of meaning are those who survive. We all have our own sense of personal meaning, and it is upon us to find that sense of personal meaning. That each individual has their own meaning, whether it's work meaning, whether it's in their personal lives, whether it's in their experience, and whether it's in other aspects of life. Each individual has their own sense of meaning. For example, in the case of the prisoner who was waiting for their child, their love that they felt from their child is what their meaning was. For the scientist, it was their love of knowledge. That's what their meaning was. For Dr. Frankl, it was the meaning derived from his love for his wife, as well as his academic pursuits and sharing with the world his insights. Dr. Frankl knew that he was the only individual in the world that could write the book that he needed to write. That book that would talk about and become Man's Search for Meaning, for example, that book was the only one that could be written by him alone. Why? Because of his academic experience, because of his professional experience, and because of his experience in concentration camp. All of these things allowed him to be the unique individual to write that book, and the only individual to write that book. That gave him tremendous meaning. To the extent that Dr. Frankl would go in the yard in the concentration camp and find scrap pieces of paper and write down and jot down his ideas. This gave him immense meaning to survive and persevere and get through the most difficult times. Channel this in your own life to find your own individual, particular, specific sense of meaning, and you will gain strength and resilience through it. Ironically, despite the success of Dr. Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, Dr. Frankl himself did not consider the book to be his greatest achievement. In fact, he argued that and considered that the success of the book was an indication of the misery of our time. That is the lack of meaning that existed in people's lives. And it revealed the hunger for a meaningful existence that people had. I hope the insights from this book have been beneficial to you, and although the book chronicles Dr. Frankl's own understanding of his life and his own experiences, I hope you use this to channel your own sense of meaning and sense of purpose in your life so you can persevere and prosper and live a more resilient life through your challenges and the difficulties that you face. We all have our own journey, and we all have our own personal sense of meaning. It is upon us to find that. And I hope you will find the strength through this reading and delve into the book to find your own insights as well. I hope that this has been beneficial to you, and I hope you've learned from this, as I hope that this helps us become and make a more beautiful and a more resilient and meaningful world. All the best to you.